Right.
Oh, they're in that?
Yeah, I just
Oh.
had this extra stack, and I thought I'd give them
that's
a
great. I'll
hard
let them
copy.
know that. Okay, thank you.
But it's funny because someone said a couple of negative things, and I'm involved in quite a few thought partners, kids, and others doing this and doing this. And I feel like people are telling stories that aren't really true because they're not completely ramped up yet. I mean, there are some really successes, but how can they be telling a negative story?
Right. No, but I'm not. I really don't know. So I'm very clear with people. I do not know how they're going. But I actually, if you want to just see
Well, this is kind of, I mean, you're saying that, so it's happening here in some of the grants, not all the grants. They're trying, yeah, there's supposed to be the linkage.
That's the thing. So when you go in, so we do these. I'll talk to you a little bit about our process for the sort of the prize process. It's very interesting because we go in with a complete open slate, open mind, and they're different messages. And when you talk about this, they sort of say, yeah, we're different companies, but there's a culture that persists. But on this, on the post-graduation success outcomes, it is really different. The perspectives.
Yeah, definitely that. I've been kind of trying to integrate the two. I mean, I think these grants have the possibilities. I don't know if they're there yet. Some are trying. I mean, but there's not even. But a lot of the strategies are part of that.
I understand.
Yeah. So, but yeah, no, they don't.
The question is more. I love your perspective. I mean, I'm not somebody who invents stuff out of the park. I don't invent stuff out of the park. I'm interested in hearing from folks. Welcome. Hello. With these lights and everybody so far away, I feel like I'm in one of those alien movies where it's E.T. I don't know. There's welcome everybody. I'm Josh Wyner with the Aspen Institute's College Excellence Program.
You can introduce me.
Yep. And I'm here with Mindy Feldbaum from the. Okay. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay. I think my mic's on. I'm Mindy Feldbaum. I'm the CEO of the Collaboratory. You cannot hear us. Hello? I think. All right. I got to move up here. Okay. I'm Mindy. Oh, let's see. I'm Mindy Feldbaum, a CEO of the Collaboratory.
And I'm Josh Wyner, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's College Excellence Program. This session actually began because Mindy has been involved with TAA grantees and thinking a lot about the use of unemployment insurance match data at the state and institutional level. Aspen has been involved in the Aspen Prize and was really interested in the models we started to see of where institutions through that were using post-graduation success data and labor market data to improve student success. And a colleague of ours said, as we were both drafting guides on these related topics, said, do you know about Mindy's guide? And I said, well, no, I don't. And same thing happened. And so we started talking and realized that we were headed in some of the same directions, but with really a different focus. And I think this is actually an important reflection of where the field is moving. Achieving the Dream has, I think, and all of you really have done this really important work at looking at student outcomes as a way to improve student success. And largely those are outcomes related to completion and the pathway and momentum points towards completion. I think we're now seeing that the next measurable set of outcomes really are in the area of post-graduation success. With labor market success sitting at the center of that in terms of the information that's coming out. And so it seemed like a good time to start the conversation about what it is that we're seeing and really talk a little bit about how colleges, and you all are at the forefront of colleges, and I don't mean just two-year colleges, colleges that really are dedicated to improving student success, how colleges can use the data that are emerging, and literally every month more data become available about what happens to students after they graduate as a way to improve what you do while you're working with students. So I'll speak a little bit about the guide that I ran out of about halfway through the room, so I forgive the folks on this side of the room. Forgive me for not having a hard copy for you. It's on the zip drives, though, that all of you received, and the guide on labor market success is also available on the Aspen Institute College Excellence Program website. It was just released 2 to 3 weeks ago. So I'll speak a little bit about that, and then Mindy about the guide that she's prepared. The work that we do at the Aspen College Excellence Program with community colleges started with the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence. And I imagine there may be a few people here who don't know much about that. I will spend 1 minute on it. I want to quickly get to the subject matter at hand. It is an annual prize for community college excellence, and the idea is to define, to help define excellence with the collaboration of lots of folks, and then to elevate the community college sector. I think Jane Wellman's work on financing for all of your institutions has made very clear that community colleges are not adequately recognized still for the incredibly important work that you're doing. And so one goal of the prize is to elevate the sector, to, in essence, use the word community college and excellence in sentences much more often. In the New York Times, in Time Magazine, on PBS NewsHour, in the local media, in the legislatures, to recognize that there is exceptional work happening that needs to be elevated, and to have excellent practice and excellent colleges stand for that nationally, at the state level, and at the local level. The second goal is to help define and benchmark excellence, and the reason the word help appears there is we know there's lots of important work happening in that space. I'll talk a little bit about our definition of excellence, and I think it does vary somewhat from others, but in all of the work we do, we are very cognizant of the burdens that are put on community colleges as you're doing reporting. And you've got state level, those in Complete College America states have that reporting, voluntary framework for accountability. So we really try to align with a voluntary framework for accountability, the metrics that we're using with 1 or 2 exceptions, so that we limit the burden on colleges. And then finally, and the reason that this is outlined here, is to identify and replicate effective practice. Our view is that if we go into colleges with an open mind, if we see colleges that are seeing high and improving levels of student success, and then go onto the campuses and just see what's happening, bringing along with us real experts in the field, practitioners in the field, and researchers, we might uncover some things that can add to the conversation in the same way all of you have been presenting here. Our hope is that we can add to that conversation. And so here we're really talking about the identification and replication of effective practices. In the Aspen Prize work and all of the work at the Aspen College Excellence Program, it is our view that there are 4 domains of excellence for colleges, that an excellent college does 4 things in pursuit of student outcomes and does them well. One is it pursues completion and transfer, and when we say transfer, we mean 2 to 4 year transfer outcomes. And you all have been thinking about that deeply over the last couple of days and will for the next couple of days. The second is learning, that students are learning more in each course, in each semester, and in the programs they've entered than, that allow them to know more when they leave those various sections of education than when they arrive. And we really think it's important to engage faculty as in the learning process. And we're very supportive of the idea of learning colleges. And we have another guide that came out yesterday that talks a lot about how you build a faculty culture around student success that really is grounded in improving teaching practice so that students learn more in the classroom. The third area is labor market outcomes. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, equitable outcomes. which are defined as underrepresented minority students, low-income students, closing gaps and improving absolute success rates for those groups of students. So it's our view that great colleges do all four of those things. And indeed, in the Aspen Prize process, every one of the finalist colleges that we've worked with, we've seen working on multiple fronts to achieve exceptional results for students. So I mentioned that we've got two guides out. I'll be speaking about the first one today, which is about using labor market data to improve student success and how that fits into the landscape as we see it. So the first question, I guess, for colleges is why do labor market data matter and what can I do with them? You know, one of the things we're seeing is there's a lot of labor market data being released. We've got the gainful employment reports that came out. I talked to folks in colleges and they're skeptical about the value of the data. We've got the data coming out by program, by college in Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas. All of that came out. I talked to colleges in those states. By and large, they're not comfortable with the release of the data. I know that the Kentucky system is collecting huge amounts of data and is working to try to give it to colleges, and by and large, colleges haven't been that comfortable using the data. And it occurs to me that we're at the outset of a movement where there's more and more data becoming available, and the real question is not how can it be reported on in the media, or how can your systems use it against you or to limit what you do, but how can the colleges use it to improve student success? You're the ones at the front lines. And if you're not using these data, then the value of all of this work on post-graduation success will be for naught. And so there are a few ways we've seen across the country colleges using data to improve student success, and I wanted to talk about a few of those. One is just deciding on what programs to offer and the scale of those programs. And there are a lot of things that you can see from the data that will help you. Walla Walla Community College looked at the unemployment insurance match data for a number of its programs. And it found in its culinary program that students were employed but were earning really low wages. In fact, the wages were so low that they couldn't distinguish those wages from the average wages of people with high school graduates. And they started to investigate, why is that? And they found out that people were going to be line cooks in big industrial kitchens where they were earning not very good wages, often without benefits. They shut down the program. They just shut it down. Now, they didn't make that the end of the story. Walla Walla is a burgeoning tourist community. They started to ask the question, well, what are the culinary jobs available that are good? And 2 years later, they reopened the program around conversations with employers. So they went out to the restaurants and they went out to the wineries and what's happening in the area, and they found out that there was actually a pretty big demand, unmet demand for catering, and actually food trucks were moving from Seattle into some of the smaller towns. So they now have, they recruited a chef from Seattle who's now building a program around, pretty much around catering. And it's quite successful, and students are already working in that field. But it started with a look at the data. And there are other examples that are reflected in the guide that you'll see. The second is assessing program quality, and I think this makes people pretty nervous on the college level, which is, well, how, just because students aren't being employed, just because students aren't earning great wages doesn't mean that my program isn't very good. But the fact of the matter is that what students care about is getting jobs, and that's probably true on the liberal arts side as much as it is on the career and technical side. In the end, I don't know many people who go to college who don't want a job after they graduate. And so, there's a story out of California, out of Cabrillo College, that I think is quite instructive, where they were sending, and Cabrillo is in the Bay Area, for those who don't know, they were sending medical assistants out into the field, and their data were showing that they weren't getting hired. Well, this was odd because their projections showed a growth in the need for medical assistants. How is it that we're producing, I'm going to make up a number, 100 medical assistants for 1,000 jobs, and they're not getting hired? So they did two things. One is they started thinking about it, and they said, well, there are many other programs for medical assistants in the area. Maybe collectively we are overproducing. So they started to compare data with neighboring colleges, and indeed they found they were overproducing as a group. So back to deciding on programs and scale, they reduced the size of their program, and they all talked with one another about right-sizing the production of medical assistants so that they weren't sending students out into a field competing with one another for a limited number of jobs. The second, though, was that they started talking to employers, and they found out from the employers that, because when they compared their data with other colleges students were getting hired at higher rates than their students were, and they were willing to confront that hard reality, and that told them something about program quality. That suggested that they were not producing people who were as well qualified. And they went to the employers and found out that their basic English and math skills of their students weren't up to snuff, which you wouldn't guess for a medical assistant program. You might think it was about, drawing blood or whatever the issues are that are medically related. It was actually basic math and English skills. They've revamped the program, too early to tell, but again, they assessed program quality, went out to investigate, and found out that they could improve what they did. The third area is helping students choose. I think this is really important. We know there's a strong correlation between undecided students and low completion rates. Davis, I see, is here. Jenkins' work is showing that it's not just about completing a number of courses. It's that if you complete 9 courses, he showed a strong correlation, 9 credits in a subject area, you saw a strong correlation to completion. And so the point is, and Davis's paper, Get With the Program, I think makes this point quite well, we've got to get more students to decide earlier and get into a program of study. But, this is the United States, and it is neither legal nor probably advisable to assign people to programs, right? You can't assign somebody to nursing who hates blood and doesn't have the math skills ready to do that. So the question is, how are we going to get students to make decisions early? And we're seeing colleges experiment with this by, when they're being advised, undecided students about what to take, not just doing the kind of what is the inventory of what you care about and want to do, but showing them a list of the 5 or 6 or 10 programs that have the highest growth rate out into the future and good wages. So there are colleges, Montgomery College in Pennsylvania is doing this, Walla Walla again in Washington State is doing this, where students in the counseling process who are undecided are shown a group of possible majors and what the wages will be. And people say, does any of this interest you? Rather than trying to figure out what people are interested in and maybe having them study something that doesn't align to labor market demand, which is their A+ choice in terms of their personality, well, there might be an A- choice that does align to labor market demands. And if they knew that, they might choose that program more quickly and get into it. So there's a third purpose to this information, which is helping students choose programs that align to what the future labor market demand is projected to hold. And then finally is to advocate for the college. I talked a little bit about how community colleges are getting bashed in budget negotiations and conversations. And I really do think that there's a level of sophistication to actually show how important the college's programs are. And when you find a program, I see Brazosport is one of our 10 finalists. We gathered the unemployment insurance match data for Brazosport, and it's through the roof. The graduates of Brazosport who enter the labor market immediately afterwards, and most of the credentials are technical credentials at Brazosport, are earning between 150% and 200% of what the average new hire wages are in the region. Well, that's something that the Texas legislature needs to understand, and the coordinating board, when they're deciding on whether to fund the career and technical programs at Brazosport College and throughout the state. There is an advocacy tool here. This is not just about having it done to you. It's about going on the offense and saying, look, these programs are seeing great results. If we care about the economy of our state, social mobility for students, you need to be supporting these programs. So I think these are various uses that are outlined in the guide that are worth thinking about that we've seen. There are limitations to labor market data, and I just wanted to mention a couple of them. One is labor market data can't predict changes in trends. This is really important. A lot of the trends about what the jobs of the future are going to be about tell you what the jobs of the past were and try to project that out. And there is no replacement for conversations with employers and keeping your finger on the pulse of the economy. And sometimes it's about having a really good bet. Walla Walla made a really good bet that they would be able to grow winemaking, wind energy, water management into a tourist industry there and help drive that forward. But there were only 5 vineyards at the time. There are 170 now, 10 years later. They made a bet. You could not look at the labor market trends and tell that was coming. The second is they don't tell colleges how to improve. Let's go back to the Cabrillo example, right? all they knew was that students weren't getting hired. They didn't know why. It required a conversation with other colleges to realize that there was overproduction. It requires a conversation with employers to realize that it's the English and math skills that are the problem. And so it's really, as with your completion data, it is an entry into a conversation, and you need to have the kinds of deep, honest relationships with employers that will help you figure out why, and also the kind of culture that leads to the time and space to process this information when you've gathered it, so that people can come up with a theory about what to improve in the future. Sort of that culture of inquiry that my colleague Rob Johnstone with the RP group talks about so much, creating the time and space for this. So just as you create time and space to talk about the limitations on completion, the same needs to be done here, because it will not tell you the answers. So sources of data, I'm not going to go into great detail here. I think it's fair to say that in addition to the surveys that you all are doing, and by the way, a lot of those surveys with very low response rates are pretty unreliable, but Monroe Community College is noted as having hit 70% response rates for its surveys through a very intentional process. So surveys can be a valuable instrument as one way to collect data. But there are a lot of other data sources that have come online. There are federal data sources from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census. There are some private providers that are coming online that people are starting to use. They're all in the guide, and I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into the technical details about these. I think the important thing to understand is we don't have any one perfect data source, but there's a lot of good data out there. The last thing I want to say is something about emerging trends. So if you look at the data coming out of Virginia, Tennessee, and gainful employment data that came out, again, all imperfect. But for those who don't know, Virginia and Tennessee have put out reports that are all available publicly. Arkansas did this too, but there's no report for it, where they reported out the employment and the earnings outcomes, excuse me, not employment, earnings outcomes by program, by college, for every public college in the state. And this is really a first sort of big public data dump that was organized. And in addition, the gainful employment. So I spent a little bit of time with those data trying to see where the trends exist. And I think there are strong outcomes for some technical associate's degrees that are pretty powerful, sometimes better than bachelor's degrees. So I think when we start to disaggregate the associate's degrees, you start to see wildly different outcomes. And for some of the career-oriented technical programs, there are pretty strong outcomes that I think can prove the value of those. There's a low match rate, though, for many bachelor's degrees. What do I mean by that? We're not finding a lot of bachelor's holders the year after getting the bachelor's degree in the workforce, which suggests that they're going on to graduate school or they're not fully employed. Similarly, for your two-year degrees that are in the general education side, the match rate is lower, as you might expect, than they are for the scientific bachelor's and associate's degrees. One of the things, though, that we see is that those students who do leave community college with two-year credentials and enter the workforce, and this is really an early first impression, aren't seeing very good earnings outcomes. If you leave the community college with a two-year credential that's non-career and technically oriented, it's not in a CTE or STEM field, doesn't look great. Now, the match rate is low. We don't know everything about this. We need more information. But I think it's worth asking whether the value of that associate's degree really needs to much more frequently articulate to a four-year degree, where the values seem to be maintained. So, if I were to look at the data now and have a hypothesis about what they're saying to us, I would say applied associate's degrees seem to have value, and this is general. Bachelor's degrees seem to be holding their value. The general education two-year credentials without going on to a bachelor's where they directly enter the workforce in the year after don't seem to have a huge value. And I think as more and more states do this, present this information, we're going to have a clearer picture about this. But I do think it's really important for us to start asking the question, in addition to the excellent work that so many of you are doing on completion, what do we need to do to make sure that what is completed leads to the next step, whether that's a bachelor's degree and bachelor's completion, or directly into the labor markets? And how do we look at what happens to students afterwards as a way of reflecting on the value of what it is we're bringing to students? So let me hand it over to Mindy then to talk a little bit more about particularly the unemployment insurance match piece of this and the work that she's done.
Oh, I have a, thanks. Thanks, Josh. Well, we have to get my presentation here. My presentation is going to be a lot more specific. Josh has really kind of made the case on why labor market information is important. My presentation really is based on a National Science Foundation study that I did with the Advanced Technological Education Program. And it really was, and it was before the TAC grants came out. It was about 2 years ago. And, whoops, did I just lose it? Okay. And, sorry, I was a little distracted here. It really was the first time that, I mean, the ATE program, if you're familiar with it, really doesn't require employment outcomes after you finish the program. There's a lot of process outcomes and things like that. They're starting to think about it. So this was the first attempt for them to kind of look at the UI wage data, as well as kind of develop a technical assistance guide for colleges. So my presentation is going to kind of go into the weeds a little bit around UI wage data, which is a component of what Josh talked about. I don't know if you need to be familiarized with UI wage data. The program came to be in 1935, and the purpose obviously was for temporary and partial wage replacement for involuntary unemployed people and to stabilize the economy. I think most of you know the Department of Labor runs the program, but it really is a state-based program, and they really do it, they administer it different ways. I mean, there's some standardization, but there's also, if you were to go out into your state, there's not a one-way approach to do this. And then, of course, they collect food taxes from employers, and the information creates a database. So I assume you all know that, but thought I would put that out there. There's real strengths of the UI wage data for you to think about. There's also limitations. Okay. One is costs. It costs far less. It's very distracting. It costs far less than putting together student surveys and follow-up. The human capital in general is much less. There's the coverage. It covers 89% of the civilian workforce, which is a pretty good percentage. The accuracy of the earnings, it is based on payroll and tax withholding systems of employers, and so you really are getting very accurate data. It also has a longitudinality to it that you really can get the history of a person's UI wage records and earnings at least 2 years online, and then they really keep it far back. And then there's a standardization that really allows you to work with the data. So these are the strengths of UI wage data. The second is the limitations, of course, and there are quite a few limitations. It does cover 89% of the civilian workforce, but self-employed, federal government employees, military, postal, and railroad employees are not covered. You have to have a valid Social Security number if you're going to do a match, and that's going to be critical. Perhaps, at least for me, the biggest data limitations, and you got to kind of work with it, is that because you get this data quarterly, you really don't, there's not a start and end date for employees. So for instance, if you were to get if someone were to start at the end of a quarter and they had low wages, you wouldn't know that difference between somebody who started at the beginning of the quarter and had actually low income also. I mean, they didn't make a lot. They also, you really just get the industry code. You do not get down to the occupation, so you have to kind of make some assumptions as you go forward. And then there's no out-of-state, to get individuals who may have come to your college program that are probably going to migrate out of state, you have to ensure that your state UI wage agency has a data sharing agreement, so you may lose quite a few if they're not within the region. And then there are restrictions on access and use. So the NSF graduate employment study, and this is, before it's before TACT, everything happened before TACT, where they really started to require UI wage records. NSF really wanted to take a look at some of their programs. So we focused on 5 community colleges. One was Brazosport in Texas. We looked at 3 colleges in Texas that were in, process technology programs. And these are 3 programs that are similar, and they're most likely that individuals will not leave the state of Texas for jobs. And then we looked at 2 biotechnology programs. One was Middlesex Community College and one was Montgomery College in Maryland, small biotech programs where they're really regional and they may often leave the state. So we kind of wanted to get 2 different data collections going. We also did surveys, student survey follow-ups, which was very traditional, which in general has about a 15% response rate, very low, but we thought we would complement the data, as well as employer interviews. And those were very telling, if anything. We couldn't necessarily link the wage records with those interviews and surveys, but we thought they actually told more of a complete story. There's a lot of words on this page, but the goals of the study were to really look at the UI wage records and the supplemental data to look at employment outcomes. Really, we were also looking at the feasibility of obtaining this quality data, because at this point, most community colleges in the ATE program were saying we really can't collect it. And then was to produce this guide, which is kind of a how-to guide, and it's on your flash drive. Is that right, Meredith? It's on their flash drive. So to look at and to just so this wasn't supposed to be this mega study. It was just to put kind of the toe in the water to understand if it was feasible and what would these outcomes look like. So the research questions were, of course, around what employment outcomes for graduates for these biomanufacturing, biotechnology, and process technology programs. We looked at demographics and time following graduation, and did participation and completion lead to short and long-term labor market success. With the process technology, those were associate degree programs. With biotechnology, we looked at both certificates as well as associate degree programs to see what the labor market differences were. That's the guide. And so in the guide, I'm going to talk about the guide for a little bit, and we really tried to make it kind of a step-by-step process. Of course, we couldn't put everything in there of possibly how to access wage data, but we thought that at least it would be a good start. Having worked with a lot of the TAC grantees, there's a lot of issues going on in this country now that it's a requirement. If you had a community college, if you are a community college that has a good relationship with your labor department, that's great, or if you're like Oregon or Washington that have more of an integration, that's great. But there's many colleges across the country that are approaching their workforce system for the very first time saying this is required. So this came a little bit earlier, but I think has the same kind of steps that you should consider as you move forward. And ATD colleges shouldn't, be surprised at this, form a college leadership team around the program, define the program goals, evaluation questions, define the data requirements, establish data access procedures, and negotiate the data sharing agreements, which I think is one of the tricky parts of all this, and obtain and process and analyze the data, and then look at the data to think about program results. And as you said, the data is the data. How to do it and how to go about it is a different story. So it was more of a step-by-step. So I'm just going to kind of focus on kind of 3 areas there around defining the goals, evaluations, and questions. So, as you develop, and, whether this is a grant program or the ATE program, they really came together to look at kind of what were the categories, what was the overall goals of the program, and then what measures would you assess for results. And as you can see here, I mean, these are measures and data that you work with all the time, from student characteristics to progress completion. And then we focused on the post-program outcomes, but of course, completion and progress is very much integrated into the data elements that you needed for the UI wage agency. Secondly, this is very hard to read, and I decided to put it up here anyway, that we had to define the measures of labor market success and what we were going to look at. And so we came up with 7 general measures, and they're kind of busy from job holding to waiting between completion and first job to number of employers post-completion to duration of average of a non-employment spell. They really, so we listed them out, different measures of success as we were going to get and they aligned with the research questions. And so we had to, another important piece is defining the data requirements that are going into the data sharing agreements. And so we had, demographics, we had program and course data, and completion and credential attainment. One of the most difficult pieces of getting the data requirements was, particularly in the biotechnology program, was finding that gateway program that showed they had the intention of being in the program to be able to start to count them as a student in the program. And that took a lot of work. We were looking at pre-program employment outcomes, earnings, and wage gains, as well as post. But to decide at the moment in time, because a lot of the general requirements in some of these biotechnology, these GE requirements, it was hard to figure out the gateway course. So that was a difficulty for the programs. This is what you'll get from the UI wage side of things, the employer identifier, the proxy ID, you don't know the employer, the quarterly earnings, we looked at pre and post, and the industry that we got. And then as you look at, trying to access this data, you kind of have to look at which access models you want to work with your workforce system. I'm going to go through this quickly, but there's many ways to do this. So we just attempted these ways to put down in paper because of the states we were working with. But all the different ways as you're deciding on how you're going to access the data, you have to weigh the different levels of effort with the UI agency, with you, the college, the flexibility, the confidentiality exposure. Those all need to be taken into account as you're starting to work through different access models. So it's hard to see this, I think, but this is one model that we used in which the college, put the student information, the SSNs, and gave it to the UI wage agency, and the agency gave back the quarterly wage records with an employer proxy ID, and the college really did the composite, took all the records and the different pieces of student data with the wage data and then analyzed it. So that was one way it worked. Another way is the college submits just the SSN and all of the student data that you have attached to it. The UI wage agency really creates the composite student record and then sends it back. And then here's a clearinghouse model, and in 2 of the states, in Maryland and Texas, we had the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board getting all the student information and actually summarizing it for us. In Maryland, Jacob Francis Institute is the one who's the intermediary there, and they actually had the proxy IDs and then gave actually us individual information out for us to analyze. So it can be done in all sorts of different ways, but you really have to be mindful of what's best. You're working with your workforce system to, and your college, to make it a positive experience for both if possible. We did not have to do that. I mean, we went through an IRB process, and we didn't have to do it. This was a federal study. I mean, I think it depends on, but no, we didn't. But there, go ahead.
We did it for the Aspen Prize 10 finalists, and we didn't have to get student permission. I think that what the rules generally are that if the unit of measurement has enough students in it that you couldn't identify who the individual student is when the data get reported back to you, then you're safe. For the gainful employment reports, they decided that was 30 students. A lot of people I've talked to said that was really very conservative, that you could get down to 10 students. So if you wanted to know just for a particular program, 10 or more students, I think statistically, generally people have said, so you send them forward, you get them back aggregated.
Right.
So you're not going to get back individual student wages.
Right.
You're going to get some aggregation. And if it's 10 or more, some people might say it needs to be a higher number, then the student's privacy is protected. That's the way all 16 states that we've worked with in the prize process have dealt with this, including California and New York and Michigan, which have very restrictive privacy laws compared to some of the other states.
And we actually ran into that. One of our states was very conservative about the value, and some were much looser. I mean, we got it down to 5, but we had states that wanted more than 10. So yes, it really can range. And so then as you think about your data sharing agreement, you really need to think about, you need to be asking yourself about the objectives and benefits, who to contact. You need to be asking, who's going to negotiate at the college. We talked about, what kind of model are you going to use? What is the scope of the data elements, and the confidentiality and security. These are things that all would go into a data sharing agreement. So I'm just going to talk about some tips around accessing UI wage data. And this is an obvious one, but you need to work with your workforce system. And you really kind of want to have the conversation not when you need the data right away. So a lot of the TAC grantees are coming to workforce system, individuals at the state level and saying, this is a requirement, I need it. They never put money in their grant to, actually have them do it. They assume that it's just like this magical thing, that they're free data, but it actually takes quite a bit of human capital to be able to match the data and to give it depending on your access model. So you have to be mindful of that, and as you work with them, and depending on your relationship. And then it's really critical to understand if your college already has some existing relationship with your WIB. It was surprising because some TAC grantees were really surprised that there already were some institutional relationships in place, and it was much easier than they thought. Sure, they had to still come up with the data elements to collect and all that, but it really made a huge difference. And then, as I talked about before, you really need to understand the limits of use of UI wage data. So it isn't the end-all, be-all. It's the beginning. It's a consistent way of one piece of data that you can collect. Josh talked about employers and all different other ways. And if you can have other ways of connecting to students and follow-up, that's useful. I know some of the TAC grantees are using kind of innovative ways around technology with cell phones and texting and some other ways. So I think there's starting to be technology solutions that also you should consider looking at. You need to have a compelling rationale and requirement for why you need the data, and most of the times the workforce system should understand that, but you still need to think about that. And again, initiate, informal contacts before formal requests. You really need to have the dialogue with your workforce system if you don't have the relationship on why you want this data, why it's important. Hopefully there's some resources or your institution has agreed to some sort of agreement. And before you do the ask, I think that's, they'll be more receptive. And be flexible. And most of all, allow a lot of time. That is definitely a lesson we learned, because even getting to the point of an MOU takes quite a bit of time if you're starting from scratch. And by the time we got the data, it's usually not the priority, especially if you're at the program level. And so working, it depends on your relationship with the workforce system, but just allow plenty of time and get those data sharing agreements in place as soon as possible. So that's it. Yeah. Wow.
Do you have sample MOUs in the data, in the packet that was on the drive?
I do in the guide. There's sample MOUs, yes. How many of you, just unless there's any other questions, how many of you are using UI wage record data for your programs? We have, 3, 4? How many are considering starting to do this or are kind of being forced to because of tact or some other pressures, or you think it's a good idea? Well, some people are required, I mean, I know that some people are being required, but a lot of people think it's a good idea, and they're moving forward with their workforce system to start to create the mechanism. So, yes, you're right, there's two different things.
I think that Mindy's models are really important to think about, because many colleges, I mean, you know, when you look through what it is that's presented, it's a little bit daunting to think about starting a new data collection system and then thinking about using that at your college. And I do really think that there's a role for states and systems. So to the extent you have a coordinating board of system, we're in conversation now with Kentucky about how to create reports that every college can use about what happens to students after they graduate, so that it's not every college trying to reinvent the wheel. And I think that there's enough data out there, in addition to the UI match, there's the traditional projection data that comes from labor market projections, and there are now, anybody heard about the sort of the spidering techniques, the data, the real-time labor data, burning glass, anybody working with that?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's data where people are trying to figure out right now what are the jobs open today, so that I can try to get a sense, as a check against what the projections were 3 years ago to see what those look like today. So there's a lot of data out there, and I think particularly for smaller colleges, the notion of building an infrastructure to consistently crunch that in a way that's usable, it's really hard to imagine. I mean, it's, you know, you want to have 3 or 4 questions you're answering, and you know, having hundreds of pieces of data to crunch, it's hard to imagine. So I think starting the conversation in your state or in your region or with a group of colleges to ask, what are the questions we need to answer? I know in New York, they've been trying to get the unemployment insurance, the CUNY system, has been trying to get it for a long time, and the state hasn't been forthcoming with it. And collaboratively, they think that they're close to getting an agreement where they can get access to the data, but it took a number of colleges coming forward together to say, we really want this. In California as well, the colleges want the information. And the reason is because, you know, resources are getting constricted. And we have a 30-year trend where more and more money is going to be taken up by various entitlement programs. It's not going to leave a lot of money for colleges. And you all have to make some really tough choices about what to offer and what not to. It would sure be nice to know that the programs that you may cut aren't the ones that have the best results for students after they graduate. I mean, we want to maintain that great value for students. So I think that the importance is clearly there. The need is there, but the capacity at the college level to add this, I think, can be limited. And so I think thinking about it as a state responsibility and really working with the state, the goal in our Kentucky project that we intend to do would be to work with the colleges to devise the reports. So people don't think this is being done to them, but they are answering questions that the colleges really have. And so there are important contextual variables that you need to ask, right? If you're in a part of the state with a 15% unemployment rate versus a part of the state with a 5% unemployment rate, you should not expect to see the same employment outcomes for your graduates. It may make it more important that you target to what jobs are there, that you help develop the economy, but that's significant. If you're in a part of the state where the average wages for new hires are $22,000 a year, which is true in some parts of New York State, versus New York City where it's in the low 40s for new hires, you wouldn't expect the wages out of your programs to be as high in a rural part of New York State as you would in New York City. So it is important to gather contextual clues. And I think you all know a lot about your local communities, and working with your state, you can make sure that that people understand the nuances of this, and that it's different from place to place. But that's the kind of nuance that's much easier to do as a group when you have a system that could perhaps get a grant to do this kind of work or put some resources towards it for all colleges rather than doing it college by college.
And I think that's happening in the TAC grants in states. They're organizing together. You don't need to have the TAC grants to be able to organize also. One of the results, I mean, I didn't really talk about the results of my study, but they were very, very positive results. But just to give you just a inkling of just one surprise in, process technology, which is a male-dominated field where they actually come out with very good wages starting out at $40,000, $50,000 a year. There was one college that actually, it was the only college out of all the process technology colleges that actually showed that women were making more by a lot than the men. Well, that's a piece of data that, is priceless, figuring out what that means and kind of delving deeper into it. But they had never dawned on them. They always recruit women. They try their best to make it, all the materials women friendly, and so that's just an example of just a surprising piece of data that they're really looking at now. That's the hard one. Yeah. The question is that when you get the UI wage data, you get it at the NAICS level, at the industry level. So you cannot tell the difference between if somebody's in an occupation, let's say in biotechnology as a truck driver versus a lab technician. And so you have to work through some of the findings to see what makes the most sense. I think it's more of an art than a science to be able to do that, to kind of surmise from the occupational codes which would be more relevant. Also, you can dismiss some of the occupations because the chances that they were, a truck driver in a highly technical training program, but it's kind of a little bit of elimination to get to the point where you can, so it's more like that they're training in the industry, and then by their wages and some other factors, you can have a sense of yeah.
I think we should ask ourselves the question of how important that is. I mean, I hear this conversation a fair amount, and I think there are contexts in which you would want to know that. But there are a lot of contexts where we hold out that higher education is about transferable skills.
Right.
And I think if students are unemployed, and we need to look not just the year after, but 5 years later and 10 years later to make sure they're still employed. If students are employed at good wages after having gotten our credentials, particularly if you can do a pre and post look, but even if it's just a post look, I think that's a pretty good sense that we've given them skills that are consistently usable in a particular specific occupation or transferable between occupations. And in the student's interest and the community's interest and the state's interest and the country's interest, that's what really matters. And so I do think that even if you can't delve down to that level of granularity,
Right.
I think it's really worth asking the question, what do we as a college offer to students? Forget programs. What are the average wages? Were they better this year than last year as compared to the average wages in our region? Are our students getting what it is that they need to have successful lives? I mean, we all work, I do this work because I care deeply about social mobility. I think so many of us do. We care about these students who have no other opportunity. And if we can get them to good wages, with jobs with good wages, that's pretty powerful stuff. So I'm not arguing that it wouldn't be helpful in some contexts to have that. But I do think that sometimes we allow the lack of granularity to keep us from using the big picture data as we might.
And we did see within all the 5 colleges, we actually did it 1 year out, 3 years out, 4 years out, and we did see the wage gains, through the UI wage data.
Yeah, we did 1 and 5 years out.
I guess the other big picture piece that I think is important to look at longitudinally is that you're able to see that they're continuously employed.
Yeah.
And for that last 5-year segment you're looking at, it was during the national recession.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that continuous employment of technical skills during a recession is a very telling statistic.
I think that's right. And the point, did everybody hear that point about, that continuous employment is really important, particularly in an era where there's a recession. I mean, to be able to hold out, to understand the resilience of the skills you're providing students, especially in a down economy, can be really very powerful for convincing students to stick with it, for convincing investors to stick with it, and for understanding where to continue your investments as a college yourself. I think Patrick Kelly at National Center for Higher Education Management Systems gathered information from from a for-profit, a community college system, a four-year sector, and aggregated all of it. And one of the really important things about the long-term impact that I think is a weakness in the data as we have it now is that liberal arts degrees, four-year liberal arts degrees, really recover. The immediate wages after you graduate for engineering are very high, for these technical credentials seem to be pretty high. For liberal arts degrees aren't that high, but they recover 7, 8, 9 years out. And being able to look long-term at that, I think, demonstrates the value of a liberal arts education. And, I think that we run some risk if everybody's looking at the year after you graduate at having some misinformation about the ultimate value of a lot of things in the labor market. I think there's a great fear that we're going to dismiss out of hand a series of liberal arts credentials that don't tie directly to a job. And you hear a lot of folks in the academy saying, no, these are critical thinking skills that matter. And the data actually, if you look at the out years, are supportive of that for four-year liberal arts degrees. There's differentiation again, but what I've seen from the NCHEMS data, it makes the case. And I think that those in the colleges themselves, need to start gathering that data so that we make sure that we're not making any choices that are bad for students in the long run, but making good choices, helping them make good choices and in fact offering programs that have good outcomes for them. There was a question in the back.
Can't see.
Yes.
In our situation, we're a college that's located on the Illinois-Indiana border.
Mhm.
So a lot of our students live in Illinois or work in Indiana. Like, how do you approach, because I think my understanding is UI information is state-specific. So
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that Illinois has a data sharing agreement with Indiana. So when we looked at Maryland, Montgomery College is in the Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland metropolitan area. So we were able to get data from all three states based on the data sharing agreement. So you would go to your Illinois for I'm positive they have a data sharing agreement with their state. So I think that's how you would access it if you could get a data sharing agreement with your state.
Yeah, so there are several issues. One is, what are the restrictions that your state puts on your gathering the data at all? And that is state specific. So if you're in the Illinois side of the border, you have to abide by Illinois law, and Indiana side of the border, Indiana law. And I'll tell you that, we asked for the data from Florida and it came like that. Kentucky came right away. Michigan,
Depends.
California, New York, boy, it was like pulling teeth. We had to go to the governor's office to try to get, so it really varies state by state. And some of it is based on state law. Some state laws are quite restrictive about the use of the data. And some of it is really sort of just standard practice, where there's somebody in the state, the head of the labor agency, sometimes it's the attorney general, who basically gets to decide on a whim who gets access to the data and who doesn't. I mean, I'll be really honest that there's really no rhyme or reason. The patterns state by state. So one question is, what are the rules for your state accessing data at all? The second is whether there's a data sharing agreement across state lines. And if there is one, and you can get access under your state law, my understanding is you'll be able to get access by and large across the state line, that's going to be covered under that agreement. There's one other thing that's happening right now, though, which is the Labor Department has been trying to get states to sign on to a general data sharing agreement called the Wage Record Interstate System.
Yeah.
And there's a debate right now as to whether it could be used for this purpose.
Right.
There is an interpretation of federal law. But I think given where we're heading, the likelihood is that the federal government will get more engaged in essence, saying states have to share this for the purposes of the tag grants. I mean, look at what they did. They said you have to gather this data
Right.
to get these grants. I think we're moving in that direction. And so my hope and expectation is that states will share the data more and more with one another, and that the unemployment insurance data, the across state lines issue will go away at some point. It's really important, though, the issue that you raise, because if you want to know what the employment rates are, and you submit your student social security numbers to your state, and they say we found 60% of the students, or 70% of the students, you don't know whether the remaining 30 or 40% are unemployed, moved across state lines, and are employed. I mean, those are the two most likely outcomes. And so the problem is it's really hard to know what the employment rate is. Now, the wage records still remain really valuable, right? I mean, if you have an average for 60% of your students, if you're missing 40%, that average still is pretty meaningful, and you can look year upon year. It tells you something about what their wages are in your local region for those that you found. So I think the wage records still can be used. But for the employment data and for the Aspen Prize, we were debating how to deal with the issue of mobility. It's a really big issue, and one that you all can get involved in. I mean, I know, if you're asking for the data more and more at your state level, and you make clear that you want to use it to get better, I think that probably would make a number of people in economic development pretty happy. It ought to make them happy. But also, you should be demanding that you get better data. You want to see the real outcomes for students, not these 60% match rates. And I think that would help get states to share data. And so I would encourage you to ask for it. It doesn't take much to ask for it. It may take something to battle for it. But I think the more states are hearing that colleges want to use this, the quicker we're going to get the data in a usable form that takes into account the nuances all of you care about.
And I know that Illinois is dealing with this right now because they won 2 consortium TAC grants. I mean, it's actually a great opportunity, the TAC program, particularly if you're in a state like Illinois that really has some statewide grant programs. They're looking at that right now to ensure that they can get data for the entire, for all the states around Illinois. So I don't know if you're part of you are, so I know those conversations are happening right now.
Other questions, comments?
One thing I wanted to, is there a comment? So yes, a limitation of UI wage data is there's a 6 to 9 month lag, and that is why most colleges, particularly in grant programs, are collecting other, student surveys, or they're doing this text messaging now or whatever to try to get the data in real time. There is a real lag there, and then particularly for not TAC 2, but TAC 1 is a 3-year grant program, and you're supposed to follow up. But the Department of Labor actually has accounted for that lag time in the second round to have the second year be just follow-up. But it is, if you want it in real time, you do still have to do student follow-up surveys and phone calls and emails and other more traditional methods as you're getting the data.
I'm curious why, so you said that in 6 to 9 months it's not relevant. Say more about.
Well, for us, it's a year and a half then, because they're looked at in the 9th month of the employment of UI, but they have to exit the college for a full year.
Oh.
So it's a year and a half of what we're seeing now wage data.
Right. So I think, I would say 2 things about it. One is, if you think then about gathering the information for students over a period of time, weighting that, really looking longitudinally as to whether they're employed longer term, there's probably something to be said for stability in employment. And remember, you can look quarterly here. So you can see one of the things we tried to look at in our assessment was whether students were continuously employed over a 12-month period after graduating, or when we started looking at the data. So I think there are some really important hints about the value of programs and the outcomes for students a year and a half after, especially if you can start looking longitudinally and longer term. And it does suggest that if we could get to a space where you were getting consistent reports about this for every class looking back, that you would start to see long-term value of programs. I think that, Mindy talked a little bit about the limitations of quarterly data, right? Is that you don't know when students are hired and when they're not. And so I think UI data are really probably the most valuable for trends over time. Were you employed over the course of the full year, over a 3-year period? What were your wages over that period? Because you can be fooled by 1, 2, 3 quarters in a way that longer-term data can't. But it is a limitation. I think in the same way that community colleges that we've worked with, we asked that they gathered clearinghouse data, student clearinghouse data, and report them to us on how well students do, not just in going to 4-year colleges, but actually getting a bachelor's degree. And for some colleges, waiting until 3, 4 years after they graduate to see whether you prepared them well and got them to the right college where they're getting a bachelor's degree feels like it takes too long as a measure for you to act on in real time. I would suggest it's better than not having it at all, number one, and that we've got to start looking longer term, not just at these kind of momentum points and the completion of a degree. We've got to look at what the value of this is longer term. And I think I've talked to a lot of state legislators and folks at the federal level, and I really do think the way things are going. Unlike K-12, where it's about the learning outcomes, and in addition to graduation rates, I think it's going to be really hard for us to get there, but I think that the way people are thinking about the next wave really is here. And I really can't, especially as we start to disaggregate where people get learning, right? If you get it online, you get it in a lot of other places. If we as institutions, if colleges as institutions stop owning the credential and learning, we're going to have some external measure for what matters. And then completion doesn't become the coin of the realm anymore. And if we don't have a standardized way of measuring learning, what's left? This is it. So there's no doubt in my mind that this is going to gain currency. I can't predict beyond how quickly, in what states, at the federal level, I don't know. But it seems to me this is what happens to students after they graduate. More and more is going to be a measurement of success. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
So when you ask for data, I would think that there's a fair amount of past data. Can you get past data?
Yeah.
How far back?
Well, you may know this better than I, but I'll tell you what we did. So we asked colleges to submit the graduating class from 5 years ago to see if they were employed now, and from last year to see if they were. So we were looking for continuous employment for recent grads and wages, and we compared that to the new higher wages in the region as a way of doing comparability. For those 5 years older who graduated 5 years ago, we were able to get the match in every state that we've worked in. So I know it goes back at least that far.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It depends.
It depends state to state. So it's at least that old. And we compared that to all the average wages for every worker in the region,
Right.
just as a benchmark, not saying that 5 years out of school you should be earning the average, but it was just a ratio that contextualized it. So we were able to get 5 years ago, and my guess is you can go back, I don't know. I mean, do you know what the state of play is?
I don't. I think we went back like 6 or 7 years pre-college to look at the earnings.
To look at the earnings, so 6 or 7 pre-college, and in community college, the average time to degree, so that's 10 years old. And you
Yeah.
were able to get it in every case?
Yeah, maybe, well, one case now.
So,
And that was a
4 out of
difficult
5.
state to get most data.
Right, so that may have been more of a technical issue
Yeah.
than whether the data was actually housed there. So it's a great question, because
Yeah.
it does, if you want to look historically and try to make some decisions today, why not look back? The issue is whether you have the socials of the students who graduated. And there's also the institution or state level data that you're going to use for the match that you need to make sure that you've got in pretty good shape so that you can
Right.
send that over to the matching agency. Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming. If there are any questions that folks have,
Yeah.
my email and the Aspen College Excellence Program is on the guide, on the zip drive, and also in hard copy. We really believe that what you all are doing to try to fill the skills gap, to provide access to students to four-year college degrees after the two-year programs, and as a reform community here is incredibly valuable. And if there's some way that what we've learned through the Aspen Prize process and the other research we've done can be helpful to you, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't want to go into the difficult.